everyone, I'm back for a wrap up of the short month of February. Hopefully most people are aware by now that February was Black History Month, and I joined in with the hashtag ReadSoulIt that was created by Dee at FrenchieD. I wasn't great at keeping up with the challenge on Twitter/Instagram, but I did go out of my way to read a few more books by Black authors. I do plan to make a video featuring the 4 ReadSoulIt books that I read this month, so I won't talk about them quite so much in my wrap up. I started with Toni Morrison's A Mercy. I'd only read one Toni Morrison book before this, and that was Song of Solomon, which I didn't actually enjoy all that much. I really enjoyed this, and I will talk about it in a future video. The second book I finished was the audiobook of Dumas' The Count of Monte Cristo. This is, without a doubt, the most exciting classic that I've ever read. It may be nearly the size of War and Peace, but it starts and it just keeps going. The whole time there is amazing stuff happening and just twists and turns in the plot. It's incredible. This book was really surprising, and if you haven't read this already, then I highly recommend that you do. Then I read Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, and I have this beautiful Virago Classics edition. This is another one that I really enjoyed. The language in this took a little bit of getting used to. You go between this beautifully poetic prose and this dialect which is written out phonetically, which is also very beautiful in its own way. That took a little adjusting to, but this is an incredible story about a woman who is navigating her way through life, and it follows her through 3 relationships with 3 different men. As with the Morrison as well, I feel like this is one that would really benefit from a second reading, and I would pick a lot more up the second time, but it is certainly one that I can recommend if you haven't read it already. The next audiobook I listened to was Dracula, and this was a buddy read from Nena from SCS Reads. I believe she read it as a physical copy, but I decided that the audiobook was going to be easier for me. I can really recommend this audiobook because it's a multicast production. The way this book is written is from multiple perspectives, so it lends itself to having multiple narrators. I'll link the production that I listened to below, because if you are going to listen to it, then this is the one to go with. I enjoyed Dracula, not quite as much as I enjoyed Frankenstein. There were a few things that irritated me with the way that the women were presented, but that's not really surprising considering when it was written. It also has very strong religious themes, and I think that's quite interesting in contrast to how vampire fiction is sort of played out today. It's also quite an important one to look at in the development of this genre. Speaking of which, the next book that I read was another gothic fiction, and that is The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. These are short stories and gothic feminist retellings of fairy tales. I found this really fun. I liked the theme of metamorphosis and also this idea of lines being blurred between humans and animals, and it's made me want to read everything that Angela Carter ever wrote. Another audiobook I listened to was The Girl on the Train by Paula Hawkins. This has sort of been held up as the next Gone Girl, and it took me such a long time to get to reading Gone Girl. I thought I would actually get in ahead of the pack this time and read this. I wasn't crazy about The Girl on the Train. I can see that a lot of people are going to really love it. It's very fast-paced, a real page-turner. The characters are just as unlikable as they are in Gone Girl. There are 3 female narrators in this. The main narrator is called Rachel, and she is a very unreliable witness and an unreliable narrator because she is an alcoholic. And the way that her narration was written kind of reminded me of Maud in Elizabeth is Missing. I actually think that Emma Healy did a better job of the unreliable narrator, but if you liked Elizabeth is Missing, then you will probably like The Girl on the Train, and vice versa. Speaking of unreliable narrators and unlikable characters, I read Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. Now, I've never felt so conflicted about a book in my life. So I started reading this, and the first thing I noticed, as most people do when they're reading this book, is how beautifully it is written. There is not a word out of place in this, and I shudder to think of how long he must have spent inside the head of Humbert Humbert to write this. As I wrote in my Goodreads review, I was really torn whether to give this 1 star or 5 stars, because I really didn't like it. I didn't enjoy reading it. I cannot say that it was an enjoyable read, but at the same time I can appreciate it for what it does, and I can't deny that it's amazing. I was down to the point where I was reading a chapter a night just because I couldn't deal with any more than that, and then in the end I said on one of my days off, I'm just going to sit down and finish this because it's an important text in the history of literature, and also I'm fascinated by the way that it's been depicted visually over the years. And that brings me to this book, which I'm working my way through, Lolita, the Story of a Cover Girl, and this goes through different covers that have been created for Lolita over the years. I didn't really feel like I could properly appreciate this until I had read the book itself. I've actually been working on creating my own cover for Lolita because I think it's an amazing design challenge. This is a mock-up for one of my ideas. I've just got it covering my edition of The Secret History. On the front we've got this key shape and Nabokov, and then you open it up to see Lolita. And that's what the spine looks like. I'm going to get this printed up properly. Once I've finished The Story of a Cover Girl, I may well do a full video on visual representations of Lolita. So on to another book that I didn't particularly enjoy, and this was a surprise to me because it's by James Baldwin, but it's Go Tell It on the Mountain. I listened to this as an audiobook. I must say the narration was fantastic, but I didn't realise the extent to which this is about religion, and I found this focus to be quite stifling. It had a very claustrophobic feel to it, and I just didn't enjoy it. As always, James Baldwin's writing is beautiful, but this one just wasn't for me. Then my Murakami of the month. This month I read Sputnik Sweetheart. I've mentioned before that Sabrina was reading this for her monthly Murakami. I had set really high expectations of this. I thought that it was going to be my favourite Murakami yet, and to be honest, it didn't quite live up to my expectations. I think that's because of the way it was narrated. I feel like this was the perfect opportunity for Murakami to break away from this single male narrator and let the female characters actually talk for once. There are parts of this that are narrated by the female characters, but it's always narrated through the eyes of the main narrator, if that makes sense. So he's either reading something that one of the women has written, or he's recounting what one of the women has said to him. It kind of felt like this narrator didn't need to be there, that the story would have gone on without him. Apart from that, it's beautifully written and it's got just the right amount of magical realism for me. So I didn't dislike this, it just wasn't quite as good as I was hoping. Having read The Buried Giant last month, I felt like I should catch up with some of Ishiguro's backlist, so I finally read The Remains of the Day. This was another audiobook. It's another one that lends itself to being read on audio because it's a single character looking back on his life. I really enjoyed this. I can see why a lot of people love it, why it's their favourite Ishiguro. Personally, I preferred The Buried Giant, but I would say it's probably on a par with Never Let Me Go. One thing I will say is that there was a moment in this towards the end that just broke my heart. It was beautifully put and such a poignant sentiment, and I think it's those moments that Ishiguro does really, really well. Then this is a book that I got for Christmas from my brother. It's Where I'm Reading From by Tim Parks. This is a set of essays on the current state of publishing, of book world, of writing. As always with essay collections or short stories, some were stronger than others. The ones that I particularly enjoyed were the ones where he talked about translation. Tim Parks is an author and also a translator, so it was really interesting to get a glimpse into what the world of translation is like, how certain things can be translated in different ways, and the things that simply can't be translated. I would say that if you're a writer as well as a reader, then you would find this both interesting and helpful. From a reader's point of view, I did find most of this really interesting and insightful. My next audiobook was in translation, and it was Thérèse Racan by Emile Zola. This was another wonderful audiobook, and it was narrated by Kate Winslet. This is the story of a young woman, her husband and her lover. It's a story of inner turmoil and guilt, and the relationships in this are so fascinating. It's a great French classic psychological thriller, and it was thoroughly enjoyable and beautifully narrated. I mentioned in my last Friday reads that a friend of mine is doing an English project on women dressing as men in fiction, so I thought it was the perfect time for me to read Orlando by Virginia Woolf. Another stunning cover from Wordsworth Classics. I mean, this image relates in no way whatsoever to the content of the book. Okay, it might relate at a stretch, but it's a real stretch. There's so much that you could do with the themes in this book. It's about Orlando, and it's a biography of Orlando. And he's a man in Elizabethan England. He's just going about his life until about halfway through the book when he becomes a woman. And that's where things get really interesting. This book is an absolute masterpiece. If you're interested in gender, in androgyny, in cross-dressing, in sexuality, then this is one that you should definitely read. It's very readable as well. I wouldn't recommend this edition because the print is tiny and it's not particularly well typeset, and also it's kind of hideous, but I didn't feel too bad about turning down corners and underlining things in this edition because I'm trying to phase out the Wordsworth classics that I still have on my shelf. Then there was yet another audiobook, and this was narrated by Colin Firth, and it was superb. It was The End of the Affair by Graham Greene. I'm unsure of how much of my enjoyment of this was to do with Colin Firth's narration, but it was beautifully written as well as narrated, and was probably one of my favourite reads of the year so far. And finally, we have Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. This is just fantastic. People told me it was, and they were right. If you like The Time Traveller's Wife or the Outlander series, then you should read this because I think this is better. It's about a black American woman who becomes a bit dizzy, and next thing she knows, she's in the pre-abolition South. And we find out fairly early on that she has some sort of connection to this white boy who keeps getting in trouble. And that's all I'm going to say. There is a love story like there is in The Time Traveller's Wife, but I think it's dealt with in a better way, and the relationships in this are complex and fascinating. The only thing that stopped me from giving it a 5-star is that the writing, while it's good, it isn't spectacular, but it has made me want to read some more of Octavia Butler's work. Anyway, that was my very long-winded wrap-up for February 2015. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll hopefully see you next time. Bye!